A simple construction worker in New York was digging in the ground and stumbled upon a 17th century ship. When experts opened its hold, the whole world was stunned. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you're watching from. The noise of Manhattan was like a living creature that never slept, never rested, and never paused for breath. It roared in the rush of traffic, in the ceaseless honking of horns, in the shuffle of hurried feet, and the distant rumble of subway trains deep under the avenues. Between the granite towers of Wall Street and the looming span of the Brooklyn Bridge, the city pulsed like a restless heart. It was here, on a raw patch of ground not far from the river's edge, that the outlines of another skyscraper were beginning to take shape, another steel and glass monument that would soon pierce the skyline like a sword of ambition. The site was surrounded by steel fencing, bright orange warning signs, and the heavy machinery of progress. Cranes that swung like mechanical giants, diggers that clawed at the earth, and trucks lined up like hungry beasts waiting for their load of soil and stone. To most passers-by, it was just another construction site in a city that thrived on endless construction. To the men working inside, it was another day, another shift, another paycheck. Among them was a man who blended into the crew as quietly as one of the bolts in a steel beam. His name was Michael Johnson, though everyone simply called him Mike. He was a man in his early 40s, with strong shoulders and calloused hands hardened by decades of labor. His skin was the color of rich mahogany, his hair cropped short under the yellow helmet that had become as much a part of him as the shovel he carried. Mike was not the kind of man people noticed on the street. He was not tall enough to stand out, not loud enough to draw attention, not unusual enough to be remembered. He was, in every sense, ordinary, and yet, like many ordinary men, he carried inside him a quiet strength born of resilience. He had learned early in life that nothing came easy, that every dollar had to be wrestled from the ground, every meal earned through sweat. Mike's days began in the dim hours before dawn, when the streets were still wet with dew and the night air clung to the skin with a cool dampness. He rose quietly in his small apartment in Brooklyn, careful not to wake his wife and children, and dressed in worn work pants, heavy boots, and the reflective vest that marked him as one of the city's invisible builders. His commute was long but familiar. The crowded subway, the jostle of strangers, the faint smell of oil and iron, and finally the open sky of Manhattan when he emerged onto the street. By the time he arrived at the site, the city was already in motion, and he slipped into the rhythm of labor as naturally as breathing. Though his job was often exhausting, it was also dependable. He knew the feel of a shovel as intimately as a musician knows his instrument. He could read the ground with the blunt edge of steel, where it was soft, where it resisted, where hidden stones might lurk. There was nothing glamorous about it, but Mike took pride in his work, pride in knowing that when the towers rose, when the offices filled with people in suits, when the lights shone at night, he could tell his children that he had played a part in raising them. He did not dream of riches. His dream was simpler. To see his son through college, to buy his daughter the piano she longed for, to give his wife a home with more space and a small backyard where she could grow flowers. On that morning in late spring, the air above the site was filled with the metallic scent of machines and the earthy aroma of soil. The Brooklyn Bridge arched proudly in the distance, its cables like harp strings against the sky. Mike climbed down into the pit with his crew, the walls of the excavation already deep enough to swallow the noise of the city and replace it with the hollow echo of shouts and the grinding of engines. His boots sank into the damp earth, and he felt the familiar weight of the shovel in his hand. The foreman barked instructions from above, but Mike hardly listened. He knew his role, knew the rhythm of lifting, striking, and hauling. The work was hard, but predictable, and in that predictability there was a kind of safety. The men worked in silence, broken only by the clank of metal and the scrape of soil. Sunlight filtered down into the pit in bright rectangles, and dust hung in the air like faint smoke. Mike leaned into his task, muscles flexing with each stroke of the shovel. His thoughts drifted as they often did to his family. He pictured his wife, her gentle smile when he returned home in the evening, the way she set a plate of food before him without complaint, even when she was tired. He thought of his children, their laughter echoing in the cramped apartment, their dreams so much larger than the space they lived in. For them, he endured the ache in his back and the roughness of his hands. For them, he woke each morning to return to the pit. The ground was thick with clay that day, stubborn and unyielding. Mike dug deeper, sweat running down his neck, his breath steady. He felt the familiar rhythm take over, the simple satisfaction of moving earth, of seeing the pile grow. Around him, other men labored in their own corners, each absorbed in the task, each lost in their own thoughts. None of them had any reason to suspect that the soil beneath their boots concealed a secret older than the city itself, older than the nation itself. To them, the earth was just earth, another obstacle to remove so the foundation of a tower could be laid. But the city is a place of secrets. Beneath the glass towers and neon lights lies a history written in layers of stone and soil, in forgotten tunnels and buried relics. Manhattan has always been a place of arrivals and departures, of ships docking with goods and passengers, of piers bustling with life. Long before the skyscrapers rose, long before the bridges stretched across the river, wooden ships had anchored here, their sails full of wind, their holds full of treasures and dreams. Time buried those ships, as it buries all things, beneath the relentless march of progress. But sometimes the past refuses to stay hidden. Sometimes it waits, patient and silent, until the right hand uncovers it. Mike could not have known that his hand was the one fate had chosen. To him, the day was no different from any other. He worked steadily, his mind half on the shovel and half on the thought of a hot meal waiting at home. Yet, as the sun climbed higher and the shadow shifted in the pit, the ground seemed to resist him in a new way. His shovel struck something harder than clay, something that gave a dull, resonant sound instead of the usual crunch. He paused, frowning, and leaned into the next stroke. Again the sound came, a hollow thud, as if he had struck not stone, but wood. He crouched down, brushing the soil away with his gloved hand. The surface beneath was dark, smooth, and curved. It did not resemble the rough timbers of construction scaffolding or the splintered boards of debris. This was something else, something ancient. He tapped it with the edge of his shovel and listened to the muted echo it produced. For a moment, he thought of driftwood washed up on a beach, the kind of wood worn smooth by years of seawater. But how could driftwood be buried so deep beneath the streets of Manhattan? He called out to another worker who shrugged and guessed it was an old pier piling. The city was full of forgotten foundations after all. Mike nodded, but unease stirred in him. There was a weight to the wood, a presence that did not belong to the ordinary debris of the city. He dug a little more, uncovering a larger section. The surface curved outward in a shape that suggested a hull, not a beam, and there, embedded in the grain, was the faint outline of a metal fitting, green with age, the patina of centuries clinging to it. Mike straightened slowly. His breath caught in his throat. Around him, The noise of the site continued as before, men working, machines roaring. But in that moment, the pit seemed to fall silent, as if holding its breath with him. He looked at the wood, at the dark curve hidden in the earth, and he felt a shiver run down his spine. He did not understand what he had found, not yet, but he knew with a certainty that came from somewhere deep within that this was no ordinary beam. This was the beginning of something vast, something that would change everything. And so, in the shadow of the Brooklyn Bridge, beneath the heart of Manhattan, a secret waited to be revealed. The shovel of a simple worker had struck against history itself, and the city above continued to move, unaware that its foundation trembled with the echo of a forgotten age. For Mike, the day that had begun in routine was ending in mystery, and the ground beneath his feet was no longer just soil. It was the threshold to a story that would carry his name far beyond the fences of the construction site, into the pages of history itself. Mike stood in the pit long after the others had moved on, his eyes fixed on the dark curve of wood that emerged from the soil like a relic refusing to stay buried. The echo of his shovel striking it still lingered in his mind, that hollow thud unlike anything he had ever heard underground. He had struck stone before, he had unearthed pipes, wires, and forgotten concrete, but never had he felt something quite like this. The surface beneath his gloves was smooth in a way only water could carve, worn as if by centuries of waves, and the strange green sheen of oxidized metal set it apart from any ordinary timber. He tried to shake off the unease, to tell himself it was nothing but an old piling, part of the skeleton of some long-demolished dock, but every instinct in him whispered that this was different. As the hours of the day passed and the sun shifted its weight across the sky, the work site remained alive with its mechanical symphony. The clatter of chains, the groan of machinery, and the voices of men calling to one another drowned out the quieter thoughts of mystery. Yet Mike could not forget the thing he had struck. When the foreman called for another section of the pit to be dug, Mike worked mechanically, but each time his shovel entered the earth he expected to hear again that hollow, ancient sound. The thought distracted him so much that when the whistle blew for a break, he found himself drawn back to the patch of ground where the wood protruded, brushing away loose soil with the edge of his boot. That evening, as he left the site and boarded the subway for the long ride home, his mind was still full of the image of that curved fragment. The train rocked gently as it carried him under the city, and the faces around him were tired, absorbed in their own small battles. He thought of telling someone about it. His wife, perhaps, or one of the men on his crew, but something held him back. He did not want to be laughed at for treating a piece of buried wood as if it were treasure. Yet, deep down, a quiet spark had been lit, a feeling that something enormous lay just beneath the surface of his ordinary life, waiting for him to dig it free. The next morning brought with it the same routine: the early alarm, the crowded train, the familiar smell of diesel and dust. But Mike returned to the pit with a sense of anticipation he could not quite hide. When he reached the spot, the soil around the fragment had shifted overnight, loosened by the work of others and by the natural settling of the ground. He crouched down and began to scrape at it with his hands. More of the curved surface emerged, and this time there was no mistaking its shape. It was no piling, no dock beam. It was part of a hull, the side of something far larger than anyone on the site could have imagined. Word spread quickly among the men. Soon, several gathered to look, some laughing, some frowning with curiosity. One of them swore it was the remains of an old ferry, buried when the shoreline was extended. Another guessed it was the wreckage of a barge, but none of their explanations matched the size and craftsmanship of the wood they were uncovering. The grain was different, harder, seasoned not by time in a warehouse, but by the sea itself. And there, embedded in the surface, they saw the faint lines of carvings, too deliberate to be natural, too ornate to belong to a utility vessel. The foreman was called over. At first he was impatient, dismissing it as debris, something to be pulled out and discarded. But when his eyes caught the metallic glint of a corroded fitting and the strange arc of the hull, his tone changed. He ordered the work in that section to stop and called the city. Within hours, officials arrived at the site, their suits and polished shoes incongruous against the mud of the pit. They peered down with curiosity, whispering to one another, their phones snapping pictures. Mike watched them from a distance, his heart pounding with a strange mixture of pride and fear. He had been the first to touch it, the first to hear its voice through the soil, and though he said nothing, he felt a sense of ownership that no one could take from him. By the end of the day, archaeologists had been summoned. They descended into the pit with delicate tools and careful hands, brushing away the earth where the heavy machines could not reach. The men on the crew were reassigned. Their work halted in that area, and the site took on the air of a dig rather than a construction project. Mike lingered on the edges, watching as the specialists traced the lines of the wood, their excitement growing with every new inch revealed. Piece by piece, the shape came into focus. The curve of the hull was unmistakable, broad and powerful, designed to ride the waves of an ocean, not the calm waters of a river. Bronze fittings, green with corrosion, clung stubbornly to the wood, evidence of craftsmanship from another age. Then came the first undeniable clue, a fragment of a cannon barrel, its metal still dark and menacing after centuries underground. The archaeologists fell into a frenzy of whispers, their hands trembling as they carefully cleared the soil from around it. Mike felt the world tilt around him. The laughter of his co-workers, the indifference of the foreman, the routine of his days. All of it seemed to vanish in that moment. He realized that what he had struck with his shovel was not just a piece of history, but the doorway to something that could rewrite everything they thought they knew about the city. This was not the wreck of a ferry or a barge. This was a ship. A great wooden ship that had once sailed under full sail across oceans, now resting silent beneath the streets of New York. The archaeologists speculated late into the evening. Some suggested it was a colonial vessel, perhaps Dutch or English, lost when the shoreline was filled in centuries ago. Others shook their heads, pointing out the unusual fittings, the scale of the hull, and the sheer improbability of such a ship being buried so deep and so intact. They needed more evidence, they said. They needed to see the markings, the construction style, the artifacts hidden within. As night fell and the crew dispersed, Mike lingered one last time by the edge of the pit. The fragment of the hull glowed faintly under the harsh construction lights, like the bones of some ancient giant just beginning to emerge from its grave. He thought of the centuries it had lain there, silent, waiting for a shovel to awaken it. He thought of how easily he might have struck elsewhere and never noticed. The thought sent a shiver through him. Fate had chosen his hands, and though he could not explain why, he felt the weight of that choice settling on his shoulders. He returned home that night in silence, his wife asking about his day as she placed food before him, his children laughing in the other room. He smiled and nodded, but inside he carried a secret too vast to share. Beneath the concrete and steel of Manhattan, beneath the rushing subways and the endless towers, a ship had been sleeping. And now it was stirring. The first discovery had been made, and the world, though it did not yet know it, was about to change. Morning rose over Manhattan with its usual mix of urgency and indifference, the skyline catching the first light like a wall of glass and steel set aflame. Down in the excavation pit, however, the world felt utterly different. What had begun as another day's labor in the march of progress had transformed into something uncanny, something that pulled the weight of centuries into the present. The discovery from the day before had not been an illusion, nor a fragment of misidentified wreckage. It was real, and it was growing larger with each handful of soil removed. Mike stood at the edge of the pit, his boots dusty, his reflective vest dulled by use, watching as the archaeologists returned with renewed energy. Unlike the workers who still thought of deadlines, schedules, and concrete foundations, these specialists carried an air of reverence, as though they were approaching a cathedral that had lain hidden under the streets. Machines that once roared with abandon now stood idle, silenced by the weight of preservation. Delicate brushes replaced the teeth of excavators, and trowels took the place of shovels. The foreman muttered about delays and costs, but his words carried no weight here. The city itself had intervened, sending officials, preservationists, and even law enforcement to guard the site. News of the find was beginning to spread beyond the construction fences, and curious faces pressed against the barricades above, drawn to the spectacle of the earth yielding up something that did not belong to the world of steel and neon. The team moved methodically, their hands steady, their voices low. Slowly, painstakingly, more of the buried structure was revealed. The curved timbers extended far beyond what anyone had imagined, rising from the soil like the ribs of some long-dead leviathan. Bronze nails still held firm where they had been driven centuries earlier, green with corrosion but stubbornly intact. Fragments of rigging, once taut and alive with wind, lay in tangled remnants, their fibers hardened by time but still clinging to their form. Then came the moment that silenced even the most skeptical. As layers of clay were brushed aside, a round shape emerged, unmistakable in its power and purpose. It was the mouth of a cannon, its barrel crusted with centuries of earth, but its intent still clear. A gasp rippled through the gathered crowd. Cannons did not belong to ferries or barges. Cannons belonged to warships, to galleons that had carried empires on their decks. The archaeologists bent closer, their hands trembling as they uncovered more of the weapon, tracing the markings faintly etched into the bronze. These were not the stamps of America's colonial past. These were older, more foreign. Mike felt his chest tighten. He remembered the first strike of his shovel, the sound that had echoed up his arm. That simple act had awakened something vast. He moved closer, standing behind the cluster of archaeologists, his eyes locked on the cannon as if it were speaking directly to him. The markings grew clearer as they wiped away the soil, a crest, a crown, and the letters of a language that was not English but Spanish. The murmurs of the experts swelled. One name began to surface among them, whispered with disbelief, Nuestra Señora de Atocha. The words felt heavy in the air, and though Mike did not fully understand their meaning, he sensed their power. The archaeologists explained in hurried tones, their excitement spilling into every sentence. This was not just any ship. This was a galleon lost in the year 1622, part of the Spanish treasure fleet that had carried unimaginable wealth across the Atlantic. It had vanished in a hurricane, its wreck scattered, its riches swallowed by the sea. Yet here, and possibly in the depths of Manhattan soil, its bones were emerging. How it had come to rest beneath the city was a question no one could answer yet, but the evidence was undeniable. More cannons followed, each bearing the same marks of the Spanish crown. Then pieces of navigational instruments surfaced, a compass whose needle had long since stilled, fragments of astrolabes dulled by centuries, but all unmistakably belonging to an age of exploration and conquest. The hall grew larger, its scale dwarfing the men who worked around it. What had once been dismissed as an oddity was now a revelation. Reporters crowded the barricades, their cameras flashing, their voices shouting questions that no one below would answer. The city was stirring with rumors that treasure lay buried beneath Manhattan, that gold and emeralds slept in the ground where commuters hurried past. Officials argued quietly, their eyes betraying their fear of what this would mean. A tower could not rise here now, not over a find of such magnitude. This was no longer a construction site. It was a monument unearthed. Mike, though, felt the revelation differently from the others. For the archaeologists, it was history. For the reporters, it was a headline. For the officials, it was a problem. But for him, it was destiny. He had been the one to strike it first, the one to hear its voice in the earth. His hands had pulled the first soil from its surface, and though no one said it aloud, he knew that this connection bound him to the ship in a way none of the others could claim. As the day wore on, more details came to light. Ornate carvings emerged along the stern, softened by time, but still visible. Swirling patterns, angels and shields, reminders that this was not just a vessel of war, but a floating cathedral, a symbol of faith and empire. The archaeologists treated it with awe, sketching every inch, photographing every angle. When a fragment of a wooden cross was uncovered, even the hardened laborers fell silent, their usual banter stilled by the sense that they were standing in the presence of something sacred. The connection to the Atocha grew stronger with each artifact. Records confirmed that the ship had been built in the 1620s, that it had been loaded with immense treasure in Havana, and that it had sunk during a hurricane off the Florida Keys. But here was the impossible. Either the records had lied, or there was more to the story than anyone had imagined. Some speculated that a part of the fleet had been separated, blown far north by the storm, and lost in a place no one thought to search. Others whispered of cover-ups, of treasures hidden deliberately. None of it mattered in that moment. What mattered was that the Atocha, or something very much like it, lay here beneath Manhattan, and it was awakening after 3 centuries of silence. As evening fell, the site was lit with floodlights, their harsh beams turning the soil into a stage where history revealed itself piece by piece. Mike lingered as long as he could, reluctant to leave, his eyes fixed on the ship that seemed to grow larger with every passing hour. He imagined it once in full glory, its sails catching the wind, its cannons bristling, its decks crowded with sailors and officers, its hold heavy with gold and emeralds. Now it was his to witness, his to discover, and though he had no claim to it by law, he felt in his bones that fate had chosen him for this. When he finally left the site and walked into the city streets, the noise of Manhattan felt different. The honking cars, the flashing lights, the rush of people seemed shallow compared to the weight of what lay underground. The city above was alive, yes, but beneath it the past was stirring, and with it came a story that would shake everything. Mike returned home with the soil still clinging to his boots, carrying with him the knowledge that the world was about to learn what he already knew. A Spanish galleon, long thought lost to the sea, had been sleeping under Manhattan, and he, a simple worker, had been the one to wake it. The night after the cannons and carvings had been revealed, Manhattan barely slept. News outlets from around the world broadcasted images of the pit glowing under floodlights, showing fragments of timbers, bronze fittings, and the unmistakable mouths of ancient artillery. People gathered along the barricades even at midnight, their faces pressed against the gaps, drawn not only by curiosity but by a primitive thrill that something priceless might lie hidden beneath the city. In apartments across the boroughs, families whispered about lost treasure, about chests of gold, about the possibility that beneath the sidewalks they had walked for years lay wealth enough to change a nation. Officials did their best to control the chaos, but they could not restrain the growing fever. What had started as whispers was quickly becoming a roar. When morning came, the site was already filled with men and women in protective suits, their brushes and instruments replacing the shovels and picks of the laborers. Mike was no longer allowed to take part in the work directly, but he refused to leave. He stood with the other construction workers, leaning on the barrier, watching the archaeologists descend like priests into a holy sanctuary. He had never been a man to care much for history books or museums, yet now he could not take his eyes off the scene. This was his discovery, his accident, his destiny. Even if his shovel had only been the first of many, he felt as though his own blood pulsed through the timbers of that ship. The day began slowly, the soil resisting, the layers stubborn. But then the earth softened and the interior of the hull began to open. The archaeologists reached what they suspected was the lower deck, and there, entombed in silt and clay, lay objects that made their hands tremble. At first it was a wooden box, so eaten by time that it crumbled at the edges when touched. Inside, however, was a glint. Silver coins, tarnished but unmistakable, pressed together like a frozen river of metal. The archaeologists froze, then carefully lifted the box out into the light. Reporters surged forward at the edges of the fence, cameras flashing like lightning storms. The coins were displayed for a moment, then quickly whisked away to a secure container. It did not stop there. Another box, heavier and bound with the rusted iron, was dragged into the open. This time, when its lid gave way, the contents caught the sunlight with a brilliance that left even the most hardened men speechless. Gold bars, stacked with military precision, each stamped with marks of the Spanish crown, gleamed as though they had been minted yesterday. Their weight seemed to bend the air itself to command silence. The archaeologists whispered numbers, calculating even as their hearts raced. Dozens of bars in just one chest. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, still buried deeper. Mike felt his breath hitch in his throat. He had known the ship carried treasure. Anyone who listened to the archaeologists the day before could have guessed as much, but the reality was different. To see it, to watch centuries of myth become solid gold under the unforgiving Manhattan sun, was something else entirely. He thought of his children, of their futures, of the years of struggle his family had endured. He thought of the way his wife carefully clipped coupons to save a few dollars at the store, and here, only a few feet away, was wealth enough to erase generations of hardship. He gripped the barrier tightly, his knuckles whitening, the weight of temptation heavy on his chest. The discoveries poured out as the day went on. A cluster of emeralds, their green fire burning even beneath the crust of centuries, rolled out of a cracked chest like frozen drops of sunlight. They were as large as thumbs, some even larger, their edges catching the light and scattering it in dazzling shards. Experts gasped, whispering about Colombian mines, about fortunes that could rival the treasures of kings. There were necklaces, too, tangled in ropes of gold and pearls, some broken, some whole. A goblet of silver surfaced, its surface etched with saints and angels, a relic of devotion that had traveled across oceans only to sleep for centuries under Manhattan. With every new chest uncovered, the fever in the air grew. Officials ordered the site sealed more tightly, guards positioned at every corner, yet still the crowd swelled, and still the whispers multiplied. People spoke of billions, of the greatest treasure ever found on American soil. The sum was beyond comprehension. 1 billion, perhaps more, in gold, silver, and jewels. The figures tumbled through conversations like dice in a gambler's hand, each one more fantastic than the last. For Mike, the numbers hardly mattered. What mattered was the sight of it, the knowledge that he had been the one to begin this. Cameras flashed, news anchors shouted into microphones, archaeologists carefully cataloged each item. But in his heart, he knew that none of it would have been here if not for the dull thud of his shovel. He felt pride, yes, but also a strange ache. The treasure was close enough to touch, yet impossibly far from his reach. The archaeologists worked into the evening, their gloves dark with soil, their faces weary but glowing with exhilaration. Piece by piece, the lower deck gave up its secrets. They uncovered tools of sailors long dead, wooden chests of navigational charts turned to pulp, a crucifix blackened with age but still intact, its figure of Christ staring out with a sorrowful gaze. These finds humanized the wealth around them, reminding all who watched that men had lived and died for these treasures, that this glittering fortune had once been the cargo of desperate sailors and ambitious kings. As the sun set, the floodlights once again lit the site, casting the gold and jewels into harsh brilliance. The treasures were carefully packed away, loaded into armored trucks and sent to secure vaults under armed escort. Yet the hull itself still lay in the pit, silent, its belly not yet emptied, its secrets not yet fully told. Mike remained at the site long after the others left, his body still, his mind racing. He thought of what it meant that such treasure had slept beneath the streets for so long, ignored, stepped over by millions who had no idea the wealth under their feet. He thought of the cruel irony that the city, with all its hunger and struggle, had carried riches beyond imagination just inches below its foundations. And he thought of himself, not a historian, not a politician, not a man of wealth or power, but a worker whose shovel had kissed history awake. The night wind blew through the steel skeletons of the city, carrying with it the faint scent of the river. Above him, the lights of the Brooklyn Bridge burned steady, indifferent to the miracle below. Somewhere in the distance, the low wail of a siren rose and fell, the city's endless heartbeat continuing. But here, in this pit of earth and history, the world had shifted. The treasures of Spain had returned, and with them came questions, conflicts, and destinies that no one, least of all Mike, could yet comprehend. The morning after the treasures had been lifted from the earth, New York awoke to a different rhythm. It was not the usual thrum of stock tickers or the impatient pulse of traffic that dominated the city's consciousness, but the echo of gold and emeralds unearthed from beneath its foundations. Every newspaper splashed the same story across its front page. Every news channel replayed the same images. Gleaming coins cascading from a chest, emeralds glinting under harsh lights, and the stunned faces of archaeologists who had touched history. Crowds gathered near the site in greater numbers than before, pressing against the fences until the police were forced to expand the perimeter. Tourists who had come to see the Brooklyn Bridge now found themselves drawn instead to the dig below, whispering as though the earth itself were telling secrets. Inside the pit, the atmosphere had shifted from wonder to something heavier. The archaeologists still moved with reverence, but their conversations carried an edge of urgency. Historians arrived from universities, archivists from museums, experts in Spanish colonial history and maritime trade. They stood in small clusters, arguing, pointing to sketches and records, their voices low but intense. The treasures confirmed the identity of the ship beyond doubt. The markings on the bars, the designs etched into the coins, even the style of the carvings all traced back to one name: Nuestra Señora de Atocha. Yet that certainty only deepened the puzzle. How could a ship believed to have sunk in the waters off Florida be buried here, thousands of miles away beneath the streets of Manhattan? Theories bloomed like weeds in fertile soil. The most cautious suggested that perhaps it was not the Atocha itself, but another vessel of the same fleet, blown wildly off course in the hurricane of 1622 and lost farther north than anyone imagined. They cited old Spanish records that mentioned ships separating in the storm, some vanishing without trace. Could one have drifted up the coast, battered and broken, until it foundered near the mouth of the Hudson? Others rejected this, pointing to the improbability of such a voyage and the lack of accounts from the Dutch colonists who lived in New Amsterdam at the time. A more daring hypothesis claimed that the ship had been deliberately hidden. According to this version, Spanish sailors, fearing pirates or political enemies, had sailed northward under secret orders, burying their treasure in the relative obscurity of the northern colonies. They may have intended to recover it later, only for the secret to be lost to death and time. The idea inflamed the imagination of the public, conjuring images of clandestine voyages, conspiracies that stretched across empires, and treasures deliberately entombed where no one would look. There were also whispers of something stranger. Some clung to the notion of a cursed ship, one that had vanished and reappeared, slipping through storms as though the ocean itself had conspired to hide it. Journalists seized upon this angle, weaving tales of a phantom galleon that had roamed the seas until it finally gave up its ghost beneath Manhattan. It was nonsense to the archaeologist, yet the story captured the imagination of millions, spreading through social media like wildfire. Amid these debates, one figure remained both central and strangely overlooked: Mike. He stood at the periphery of the pit each day, no longer a worker but a witness. His shovel had been the first to strike wood, his hands the first to uncover history, yet in the discussions of scholars and officials his name was barely mentioned. He listened to their theories with quiet fascination, though, and in his own mind he tried to piece together the story. He thought of the storm the historians described, of sailors clinging to ropes as waves tore their ship apart. He thought of desperation driving them northward, seeking shelter, perhaps praying for deliverance that never came. He thought, too, of the silence that had followed, centuries of soil swallowing the evidence until he, a man of no importance, had broken the silence with the dull strike of a shovel. The arguments reached beyond the pit. Spain's government issued a formal statement claiming the treasure as their cultural patrimony, demanding its return. American officials countered that the ship was found on U.S. soil and thus belonged to the nation. Legal experts filled television panel, dissecting treaties and precedents, their voices heated, their conclusions murky. Investors and corporations smelled profit, proposing exhibitions, museums, and auctions. The world had turned its gaze upon the Atocha once more, and this time the battleground was not the sea, but the courts and the media. Mike found himself swept into the storm of attention whether he wanted it or not. Reporters began to seek him out, the man whose shovel had started it all. At first, he resisted, retreating from cameras, answering in monosyllables. But gradually, he realized that his story carried weight. People wanted to know who he was, how he had found it, what he felt when the first curve of wood emerged. They saw in him something different from the experts and the officials. He was not a scholar or a politician. He was an ordinary man who had stumbled upon a miracle. In him, they found someone they could understand, someone whose awe mirrored their own. Yet, even as his name appeared in headlines, Mike felt the burden grow heavier. He had no claim to the treasure in legal terms, no right to the gold or emeralds. He knew that. And yet, he could not help but feel a connection deeper than law. Without his hands, without his shovel, the ship would still lie silent. It was as though fate had chosen him as the vessel for this revelation, and with that choice came a weight he struggled to bear. The debates among scholars intensified. Some insisted the ship had never truly sunk in Florida, that history had mistaken one wreck for another. They pored over records of salvage attempts, of rumors of missing ships, of discrepancies in the lists of cargo. Others scoffed, demanding evidence, unwilling to discard centuries of accepted history. Theories clashed like swords, each defended with passion, none able to pierce the veil of mystery. Through it all, the Galleon lay quiet, its timbers dark against the soil, its treasures partially removed, but its essence still bound to the earth. It seemed almost to mock the debates above, its silence more eloquent than any words. And in that silence, Mike often stood alone, staring at the ship's outline as though it might answer the questions no one else could. He did not care for the academic arguments, nor for the legal claims. What haunted him was the thought of the men who had sailed it, who had lived and died in its service. He imagined their voices on the wind, their prayers in the storm, their despair as the ship sank into darkness. He felt, in some quiet corner of his heart, that they had waited for him to find them. As dusk settled over Manhattan, the pit glowed once more under harsh floodlights, and the arguments continued into the night. The mystery remained unsolved, the theories multiplying with every passing hour. But for Mike, the truth was simpler. He had uncovered not just a ship or a treasure, but a story, one that bound the past to the present in a chain stronger than gold. And though the world clamored for answers, he knew that some mysteries were not meant to be solved, only honored. The weeks that followed turned the excavation pit into the most contested patch of earth in America. What had once been a simple construction site was now swarmed with security guards, lawyers, politicians, and representatives of foreign governments. The barricades had been pushed farther back to control the flood of onlookers, but the crowds only grew, spilling into the streets with banners, cameras, and shouted slogans. To some, the Atocha was a historical treasure that belonged to humanity. To others, it was Spanish property, stolen by accident of geography. To still others, it was the rightful wealth of the United States, a national fortune unearthed on its own soil. The debates raged endlessly, filling television screens and front pages. Yet amid all the noise, Mike found himself thrust unwillingly into the spotlight. At first, he had resisted the interviews, standing silent at the edge of microphones, giving only curt nods or a few plain words. But his story had a pull no scholar or politician could match. The cameras adored him. The simple laborer whose hands had struck gold, the quiet man who had lived a life of struggle only to awaken history with a single blow of his shovel. Reporters began to follow him home, filming his children as they walked to school, shoving microphones into his wife's weary hands. He became a symbol, though he had never asked for it, the living embodiment of the idea that miracles could happen to anyone. His face appeared on magazine covers, his name trended online, and strangers began to stop him in the street, shaking his hand with awe as if touching him might pass on some measure of his luck. But luck was a dangerous word. For while the public celebrated him, the storm gathering behind closed doors was darker. Lawyers explained to him in careful tones that he had no legal claim to the treasure, no matter that his shovel had been the first to strike it. The ship belonged, they said, to the state, or to Spain, or to some complicated legal arrangement no ordinary man could unravel. Mike nodded quietly at their explanations, but inside he burned with the knowledge that without him, the treasure would still be buried in silence. He had not asked for riches, but he could not shake the thought of what that gold and emeralds could mean for his family, for the years of sacrifice his wife had endured, for the future he dreamed of for his children. Public pressure began to mount. Journalists, sensing the tension, framed the story not only as a legal battle between nations but as a moral battle involving Mike himself. They asked whether it was right for the man who had uncovered the Atocha to walk away empty-handed, while governments and corporations fought over billions. Some portrayed him as a folk hero cheated by the system, others as an unwitting pawn caught between giants. His image appeared on late-night talk shows, his story dramatized in news specials. He could not escape it. The pressure weighed on his family, too. At night, his wife sat at the kitchen table, her face etched with worry as reporters lingered outside their apartment, their cameras aimed at the windows. His children, once anonymous, now heard whispers in the school hallways, some envious, some cruel. "Your dad found $1 billion, classmates sneered. "Why are you still here?" The weight of the treasure pressed upon them all, even as not a single coin passed into their hands. And yet, one morning, a sliver of hope emerged. After days of furious debate, officials announced that Mike would be recognized not as the owner of the treasure, but as its discoverer, the man whose labor had made the find possible. The state, under growing public outcry, decided to grant him a share of the find, a gesture, some said, of goodwill, others of politics. It would not be billions, not even hundreds of millions, but enough to change his life forever. When the figure was read aloud, Mike felt his knees weaken. Millions. More than he had ever imagined touching in his lifetime, more than his father or grandfather could have dreamed. Enough to buy a home, to secure his children's future, to ensure his wife would never again have to count coins at the grocery store. Enough to raise him for the first time beyond survival into something like freedom. The news broke across the city with the same force as the first discovery. Crowds outside the site cheered. Some wept, as though his good fortune were their own. Headlines proclaimed him the billionaire worker, though the truth was far from that. He would never own the treasure outright, never swim in the endless riches that had been unearthed, but he had been lifted out of obscurity and poverty in a way that felt miraculous. For the first time in his life, the grinding struggle that had defined him was over. Yet, even as he tried to embrace his new reality, Mike felt the shadow of the treasure linger. He dreamed of the Galleon at night, its timbers creaking in the storm, its sailors shouting in desperation as the waves swallowed them. He woke in a sweat, hearing the thud of his shovel striking wood again and again. He wondered if he had been chosen by fate or cursed by it. He wondered if the treasure, glittering and silent, carried with it some burden that no amount of gold could erase. Still, he pressed forward. He used part of the money to buy a modest home in Brooklyn with a small garden, fulfilling his wife's dream of planting flowers in the soil. He set aside funds for his children's education, ensuring that their futures would not be bound by the same chains of labor that had held him, and with the rest he gave quietly to charities, remembering the nights he had gone hungry, the cold winters when the heating bill was too much. He never forgot where he had come from, never pretended that fortune alone had remade him. The ship remained in the pit, now guarded like a relic, its hull preserved as archaeologists continued their work. The treasure, secured in vaults, awaited the endless debates of courts and diplomats. But for Mike, the chapter had already been written. He had paid the price of dreams, the glare of fame, the intrusion into his family's life, the endless tug of greed and politics. Yet, in the end, he had emerged with more than wealth. He had emerged with dignity, with the knowledge that his name would forever be linked to the Atocha, that the world would remember the simple worker who had awakened a legend. And still, when he walked past the site at dusk, hearing the hum of the city around him, he felt a quiet bond with the ship below. It was as though the Galleon had spoken to him alone, chosen his hands to draw it from silence. The world saw only gold and emeralds, but he saw something else. The price of human lives, the weight of history, the fragile line between fortune and ruin. He carried that knowledge like a secret, one that no amount of money could purchase, and in that he found a measure of peace. The storm of lawsuits, political claims, and media frenzy did not vanish overnight, but eventually the noise began to dull, like the waning echo of a siren that had once screamed through the streets. The Atocha's treasure was secured in vaults under federal guard, the ship itself preserved in the pit where it had lain for centuries, and the courts continued to wrangle over ownership with the slowness of glaciers. But for Michael Johnson, the story had already taken a quieter turn. His life, once defined by the relentless grind of labor, now unfolded on different terms. The house he bought in Brooklyn was modest by the standards of the wealthy, but to his family it was a palace. It had a small garden where his wife planted roses and marigolds, their colors bright against the brick walls. There was space enough for his children to run, and a small study where he kept clippings of every article written about the Atocha. He never liked to read them for long. They spoke of billions and mysteries, of nations fighting over claims. But he kept them anyway, reminders of the day his ordinary life had been cut open to reveal something extraordinary. The money had changed their circumstances, but it had not changed Mike's habits. He still woke early, still drank his coffee with the quiet focus of a man preparing for work, though now he no longer descended into pits with a shovel. The city did not forget him. Tourists who visited Manhattan began to speak of the Galleon beneath the financial district as though it were a hidden cathedral. The government approved the construction of a museum on the site, a pavilion of glass and steel built directly above the preserved remains of the ship. Visitors would be able to look down through reinforced floors at the dark curve of timbers, the cannons still braced in their silent positions, the deck preserved as though awaiting orders from a captain who would never return. The name of the museum was emblazoned across the entrance, the Atocha Discovery, and below it, carved into the stone, a single line of recognition, unearthed by Michael Johnson, 2025. He never asked for that honor, but when he saw it for the first time, his throat tightened and his eyes burned with tears. He stood with his children, now nearly grown, watching tourists file past, cameras flashing, their voices awed. His son looked up at him with a mixture of pride and disbelief, as though seeing for the first time that his father's hands had held more than shovels and tools. They had held history itself. The years passed, and though the disputes over the treasure continued, Mike withdrew from them. He had no desire to fight in courts or to be summoned to hearings. He had received his share, more than enough to secure his family's future, and he had no appetite for the endless greed that seemed to follow gold like a curse. Instead, he turned inward. He donated quietly to schools and food banks, remembering the years when a hot meal had been uncertain. He funded scholarships for children of construction workers, knowing how hard those men labored for so little. He lived simply, driving the same old truck, wearing the same work boots, though now he no longer wore them to dig but only to garden, his hands sinking into the soil for peace rather than survival. Still, the ship haunted him. At night, he sometimes dreamed of its voyage, of the storm that had torn it from the fleet. He dreamed of sailors clinging to the rigging, praying as waves towered over them. He dreamed of the sudden silence of the deep, the treasure sinking into darkness, the wood groaning under pressure, until finally the earth closed around it. In those dreams, the sailors often looked at him, not with anger, but with something like gratitude. It was as though they had waited centuries for him to release them from silence, to let their story be told again. The museum became one of the most visited sites in New York. Tourists who came to see the Statue of Liberty or Times Square now added the Atocha to their lists, marveling that beneath the streets of the modern world's financial capital lay a ship that had once carried the wealth of an empire. Children pressed their hands against the glass, eyes wide at the sight of cannons and carved timbers. Scholars published books, filling shelves with new theories, new interpretations, new debates about how the Atocha had come to rest so far from the place of its recorded sinking. But to most visitors, the ship was less about unanswered questions and more about wonder itself. For Mike, that was enough. He knew the debates would never end, that people would argue for centuries about storms, conspiracies, and curses. But he also knew that he had touched the truth more directly than any of them. He had felt the wood under his glove, heard the echo through his shovel, and seen the treasure shine in the soil. He had been the bridge between the silence of the past and the noise of the present. In time, as his children grew and left to pursue their own lives, Mike found himself returning often to the museum. He would walk among the tourists unnoticed, blending into the crowd. He would stand at the glass floor, looking down at the ship, its dark hull still commanding the pit. Sometimes he would linger by the plaque bearing his name, though he always did so with humility. He never spoke to the tourists, never announced himself. Instead, he listened, hearing their gasps, their laughter, their whispered awe. And in those moments, he felt a quiet satisfaction. The treasure had not only given him freedom, it had given the city a new wonder, a story that would outlast skyscrapers and stock markets. In the final years of his life, he no longer thought much of gold or emeralds. They belonged to vaults and lawyers, to people who would fight long after he was gone. What mattered to him was simpler. The garden where his wife still knelt among her flowers, the children whose futures were secured, the knowledge that his name was etched in stone above a ship that had waited 3 centuries for him. He had not sought it, had not dreamed of it, but when fate offered him the chance, he had done what he always did. He had worked with steady hands and quiet strength. And so, Michael Johnson passed from the world not as a laborer forgotten among millions, but as the man who had uncovered a legend. His legacy was not measured in the millions he had received, nor in the glitter of emeralds and gold, but in the story itself. The story of how an ordinary worker, digging in the shadow of the Brooklyn Bridge, had awakened the treasures of Spain beneath Manhattan. The city marched on, restless and unyielding. But beneath its streets the Galleon still slept, preserved now in light instead of soil, a reminder to all who looked that history hides itself in the most unlikely places, waiting for the humblest of hands to uncover it. If you enjoyed this unbelievable story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. We've got even more shocking discoveries and hidden histories waiting for you. Watch our other videos right now. You won't believe what we've uncovered. And don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with your friends so they can be just as amazed.